Hello, and welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. I'm Steve Marks, Chair of the CMC's Board of Trustees and President of Hannah News Service here in Columbus. It's great to see you. We are live streamed today thanks to our live stream partners, WOSU Public Media, the Columbus Dispatch, WBNS 10 TV, and PNC. We'd also like to thank those of you who purchased a virtual seat for today's forum. We're very grateful for this support and are able to continue live streaming services in large part because of you. Thank you. Over the past several weeks, racism and its systemic bias is being acknowledged as never before. In our longstanding tradition, CMC is developing forums that provide community space to explore these issues in our continuing series, Racism, Where Do We Go From Here? Today's forum is Fighting Voter Suppression While Ensuring Fair Elections. History holds many lessons of voter suppression, the control of the vote in various ways by those in power. This is an issue of concern to this day. Local advocates and state leaders seek to make voting accessible and fair for all. What is ahead this year as Ohioans go to the polls? Let's welcome our experts. Ohio Secretary of State Frank LaRose. Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of Ohio, Jen Miller. Midwest Regional Representative and Ohio State President, A. Philip Randolph Institute, Andre Washington. And our host, journalist at Spectrum News 1, Curtis Jackson. Curtis, the stage is yours.
Steve, thank you. For the record, I'm not an expert, but I do play one on TV. We do have a number of topics that we want to get to. We want to make sure we get to everything, so let's go ahead and get started right now. Voter suppression, its history. I doubt few will doubt that there has been a history of voter suppression in this country, but where are we with that, both in looking at it in retrospect and looking at things now? Jen, we'll start with you.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the history. So clearly, the most severe form of suppression would be not having constitutional amendments that were guaranteeing the rights of people of color and women. And we are on some big milestones this year with the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. And those are our most severe forms of suppression. But even after we passed amendments like the 15th that guaranteed the right for African American men to vote, we see very quickly that there's an effort to suppress the vote, especially in the South. So by 1877, the federal government removes protection at the polls for voters of African American descent, and the registration, then we get into grandfather clauses and literacy tests and poll taxes, and by 1940, only 3% of African Americans, men or women, are registered to vote in the South. And we see also at the same time that from 1870 to 1877, lots of black men are actually making it into office. And then we have no representatives in Congress until after we get to the Voting Rights Act in 1965. So I'm not going to talk too much about this, just one more thing to say. The 19th Amendment has the same impact, where yes, it does protect women's right to vote, but we don't see Native American women getting that right till 1924. We don't see Puerto Rican women getting that right until 1935. And then, of course, the Voting Rights Act also affects women of color, especially in the South, and protecting that right. So what I would just say is we need to remain vigilant in voting access and understand that constitutional amendments are great, but what we do at the state level and what we do at the federal level are really critical too.
Andre?
Yes, thank you for the question. Blacks have faced voter suppression immediately following the Civil War. During that time, blacks ran for office, won seats in southern states and seats in Congress, but that was short-lived. Then came the ugly era of Jim Crow and night riders, who terrorized our communities and made it impossible for blacks to run for office and difficult for them to vote. And then during the Civil Rights Movement, where we fought hard. I mean, we fought hard to have a seat at the table. We fought hard to have a seat at the lunch counter. We fought hard to be able to use public restrooms. And mostly, we fought hard for voting rights. Then came the poll taxes, literacy taxes, And even today, during this digital age that we live in, there's misinformation from foreign countries, there's gerrymandering, there's so many obstacles that have been put in African Americans' way ever since the Civil War. So voter suppression is not new for us, it's just a different way of suppressing votes. We live in this era now of disinformation from foreign countries. And when we talk about voter suppression today, let's talk about paying for postage for the ballots to be sent back in. Some says that could be a form of voter suppression. If I can't afford a stamp, then I can't exercise my right to vote. I was talking to one of my church members, a young man about 19 years old, and I said, don't forget to put that stamp on your envelope. He didn't know what a stamp was. So I picked up the phone, Jen, and I called my son, a little older than that, close to 30, and thank you, I know I don't look that old. And I said, are you planning on voting by mail? He said, yes. I said, don't forget your stamp. He said, Dad, do people still use stamps? And where do I get one from? We have to train a whole new generation of voters. We don't want anyone to be disenfranchised. We want to make sure everyone has the right to vote and exercise their right to vote. You know, during the civil rights movement, there were poll taxes where people were asked how many bubbles are in a bar of soap, how many jelly beans are in that jar. And then today, during this digital age that we live in, this modern age that we live in, we're talking about paying postage. We need to have postage. We need multiple drop-off boxes. We need to make sure that people are not disenfranchised, they're not turned away, or they're not discouraged from voting. We need to make sure that voting is safe and secure for those that show up on Election Day, but we need to also make sure that if we have another primary where it's all vote by mail, that people can afford a stamp. Do you know you can't buy a single stamp? You have to buy a book of stamps. And then what do you do with it after that? I know what a stamp is, but I don't use stamps. I pay everything online. So with gerrymandering, with people forced to vote by mail, hopefully that won't happen, but if they are, and postage paid, and then educating a whole new group of folks so that they don't get disenfranchised and discouraged and they don't go another 10 years from voting, these are all things that we face in the African American community, and these are things that we've been facing since the Civil War. So voter suppression is not new for us, but like Fannie Lou Hamer, we're sick and tired of being sick and tired. Thank you.
Andre, thank you. Mr. Secretary.
Yeah, thanks, Andre, and thanks, Jen, for mentioning some of the challenges that we continue to face. The question that you asked, Curtis, was where are we now? And I think that it's important that we stop and ponder the aspect of history that we're better than we've ever been, but that's not good enough, right? If you think about the long history of this country, the founding documents talked about creating a more perfect union, and we're proud of this 240-plus-year-old democracy of ours, but we know that we didn't do democracy right from the beginning. And that's why each generation has to work to make it more perfect, right? And that's exactly what generations of Americans have done. We celebrate the 100th anniversary this year of women's suffrage, and the League of Women Voters were key in that, Jen. And we talk about, just 55 years ago in this country, just over 55 years ago, where people were beaten with sticks and chased with dogs and knocked down with water hoses in places like Selma, Alabama, because they wanted to access the right to vote. We've come a long way, and we need to celebrate that. We need to be clear to Ohio voters and to voters around the country that it's easy to vote in this state, and you should take advantage of it. It's something that people have fought for. Don't choose to disenfranchise yourself by simply staying home and not participating in this important right that people have fought for. But there is work to be done. We have to continuously be vigilant to prevent voter suppression from occurring. It's rare, but it's ugly, and it should never be tolerated.
Mr. Secretary, we'll stay with you. On the subject of voter fraud, as the country, much of it tries to move toward mail-in ballots because of the pandemic, but even prior to that, we have had issues in terms of voter purges and things like that. All of that being focused on this whole idea that fraud is a problem. Is fraud a problem? Is that a myth or reality?
Fraud is exceedingly rare, and we have to work to keep it that way. I kind of put the voter suppression and voter fraud on the same plane when I discuss these. These are things that reasonable people should be able to agree. We won't tolerate voter fraud, and we won't tolerate voter suppression. The good news is that both of them are rare, and we need to work to keep them rare. That needs to be our goal, to work to keep them rare, and we've done that in Ohio. People know that they can trust the way that you vote in the state of Ohio. We, for 20 years, have been voting by mail in Ohio. It's nothing new. It's something that Ohioans know that they can take advantage of. In fact, in even just a routine election, 20 to 25% of ballots come in by mail. We're going to see a much higher number this year, and that's a good thing. We want Ohioans to take advantage of voting by mail. We want Ohioans to take advantage of the 4 weeks of early voting we have, which, by the way, makes us clearly top 10 in the country with those 4 weeks of early voting that we have. And then, of course, Election Day in-person voting is going to be an option that's made available, and it's going to be made available in a way that is safe and healthy and accessible as well. Those are things that we work on every day, and that's what we do. And it's important that we speak truth about elections so that people know voter fraud is rare. I believe voter suppression is rare, but let's keep them that way.
Yeah, I was just going to say the League has been a part of many reforms, advocating for many reforms to protect our election integrity. Election security and accuracy are so critical to us. For example, the fact that Republicans and Democrats, you have to have one of each to manage ballots, to move equipment, to count ballots, to do audits. Those are all things that the League helped support. I do get concerned that when we are trying to improve our election here in Ohio, the idea of voter fraud becomes the reason why we can't do it. And that is a problem, I think, because voter fraud is exceedingly rare, but this fear of it is getting in the way of improving access for way too many Ohioans. And I think drop boxes, automatic voter registration, every time we go down to the State House, it feels, to try to get, and by that I mean the General Assembly, and we try to get reforms and improvements because democracy has to change, just like all of us are changing and technology is changing. As we try to do that, what we see or what we hear is that wouldn't that cause fraud? And it's just really a tragedy, in my opinion, because we have so few examples of fraud. They're generally caught in Ohio. And again, Secretary LaRose, Republican, right? The secretary before him, a Republican, says the same thing. The secretary before Houston, Jennifer Brunner, says the same thing. So Republicans and Democrats who understand voting in Ohio are clear that voter fraud is not a major problem. I'm not sure we all necessarily agree on the access piece, so I'm looking forward to talking about that.
Andre, do you believe that this idea of voter fraud is interfering with access?
Well, voter fraud, I believe, is very rare. But I do want to comment that voter suppression is just as live as it was yesterday, 20 or 30 years ago. It's just a different way of doing it. Now, are they asking me when I go to the polls how many bubbles are in a bar of soap? No. But voter suppression is still there in our community. In the 2016 election, I saw billboards that said in the African-American community that voting fraud is against the law and punishable. I didn't see those signs in Caucasian communities. So voter suppression is still there. It's alive and kicking, but it's just done a different way. You know, like Reverend Al Sharpton said, Jim Crow is still here. It's now James Crow Esquire. So don't get it twisted, folks. Voter suppression is still here, and it's alive and kicking, and we need to defeat it. We need to make sure that everybody has access to the ballot box. We should not have obstacles in their way. My sister Jen and LaRose, we all talked about multiple drop-off boxes, and I'm going to say it probably 2 or 3 more times before we leave here, but it needs to be accessible for folks. If I live in Franklin County on one of the 4 corners, why do I have to get in my car and drive all the way down to 1700 Morris Road to drop my ballot off because I don't want to put it in the mail? Why do I have to do that? Why don't we have multiple drop-off boxes? If my son wants to exercise his right to vote, why should he have to put a stamp on it? If I show up on Election Day, I don't have to purchase a stamp. But because of the virus the coronavirus right now, there are people that don't feel safe in doing that. They want to vote by mail. But I can also talk about online, getting your ballots online, because some people don't have access to the internet or to a printer or a computer. So I know I'm running out of time and I get long-winded, I apologize. But yes, voter suppression is alive today. Thank you.
This is why that partnership is so important, right? Because the dialogue that we have with Andre and Jen and other voting rights advocates across the state is so important, because Andre brings up things that I may not think of. And that's so important that we have that conversation. And that's why historically civil rights and voting rights organizations like the A. Philip Randolph Institute are such an important voice in our state. And that's why I'm glad we do have that partnership, Andre.
I'd like to pick up with one issue that Andre raised in terms of access, and that is this whole idea of drop boxes for ballots. Where are you with that?
Yeah. So in the state of Ohio, we have one per county. That's a thing that the General Assembly added just last April. And they when they passed the law that was a temporary law, they said every county must have one drop box. Now, that requirement went away because it was a temporary measure. What I've done, and I actually issued this directive today, I directed all 88 boards of elections that they will have a secure drop box available outside of the Board of Elections starting September 1st if they don't already have it. That way people have that additional option for dropping off a ballot or dropping off an absentee ballot request form. The question of whether we allow additional drop boxes to exist is one that I asked the Attorney General to weigh in on. I didn't get that decision back from him, and so I decided to move forward on this, because what I didn't want to do is subject a bunch of boards of elections to a bunch of costly litigation on this. And really 85 days before a presidential election is not a time to really change major things about the way that we run elections in Ohio. Now, my proposal from the very beginning, going back to April, was that we provide postage paid. I wanted to have that opportunity. And by the way, we could have done that entirely with federal funds. It wouldn't have cost a dime of state money. We asked the General Assembly for that, and it's, to me, very disappointing that they failed to act on that. Because if you have postage paid, then effectively every mailbox in the state becomes a secure drop box. Every one of those blue U.S. postal boxes becomes a good place for people to drop their ballot. And so I wish we had that. But again, the law does not allow us to do that, and the General Assembly failed to act on that request.
Back to the issue of the Attorney General not responding to your request. What are your plans to deal with that?
Well, it just, it was something that we withdrew that request from him. It was 2 weeks ago, and his legal team had evidently not been able to get that response done, and so I decided that we would move forward, because what we can't have is uncertainty on these kind of things. And so I issued my directive this morning that lays out how we're going to move forward on that.
Jen?
So this is a place where Andre and I disagree with the secretary, and there's a lot of times we agree. But the way we read the law, there is the authority there to have multiple drop boxes per county. The idea that a blue mailbox becomes a secure drop box is true and also not quite true. So it's true in the sense that if you have a stamp and you trust your mail service, then that is a secure drop box for you. If you don't have a stamp, if you have historically had challenges with the mail, which I personally have, not that I'm trying to beat up on the Postal Service, very, very, very critical federal agency, and that we need to keep and protect and fund. But if you do have had problems, and we had a lot of folks during the primary have problems getting their ballot in time, getting their ballot postmarked, then I just don't think we see the trust we need. So our goal at the League is to encourage as many people as possible to vote by mail, so that if we have more COVID-19 concerns, that as many people as possible are actually staying out of lines on voting day, on election day. So just very concerned about the fact that we don't have multiple drop boxes, disappointed. One thing I will say to everyone, though, access will improve with more funds. Our boards of elections are up against a challenge here. They had the most expensive primary ever, and now we have this massive election. And so please call your U.S. senators and ask for election funding as they consider the next COVID response.
Andre, you brought up many of the issues that are facing, in particular, the African-American community as it prepares for this vote. What's the best advice that you can give in order to vote in a free, fair, and safe way?
Can I respond to this first, if you don't mind? Because I'm a little upset, personally, hearing that the request was withdrawn. But before I do that, because I'm gonna beat up on the secretary in just one second, but I do want to thank the secretary. So, my grandmother always said, give the good with the bad, okay? I was in the State House when he fought hard and argued with the controlling board to pay postage. So I thank you for that, Secretary. But not charging forward with multiple drop-off box, to me, is just unacceptable. I'm sitting up here speaking and representing the African-American community because I'm black, but this would benefit all Ohioans. This is just not a black thing, it's all Ohioans. And not charging forward, and forget the controlling board, the State House, send a directive out and have multiple drop-off boxes. And because why should I have to pack my kids up, gas the car up, pack a picnic basket, and drive all the way to the other side of town just to drop my ballot off? I'm upset. I'm just now hearing this. I'm upset. I'm truly upset because now people are going to be disenfranchised about the election process because people are still trying to get over this primary where we were forced to vote by mail. So we have to massage people, get them back confident in the voting process because remember, we were told 12 hours before the election that we're going to be voting by mail. And then there was another 2 or 3 week argument on when the election day was going to be. So we still have to win over people and let them know that it's safe and secure to vote, that your vote will count, that you will be able to show up on election day, that we should be able to vote by mail and it will be counted. But let me get to your question. I'm sorry.
Well, I want to give the secretary an opportunity to respond.
Okay.
Yeah, no, and Andre and I have a great working relationship, and that's why Andre and I had a phone conversation just a few minutes ago about this, because I knew that I wanted him to be aware of that decision that we had made. Listen, it's not me predicting that there would be litigation on this. We see this just in the neighboring state. Pennsylvania decided that they were going to add additional drop boxes, and they're now tied up in a bunch of litigation. And so,
Georgia as well has several drop boxes as well.
oh, many states do. No, many states do. And I love the idea of adding additional drop boxes. Let me be clear about that. And Andre, we've talked about this, and I think, but it has to be done by the legislature. I think that it would be great if we had multiple drop boxes in every county in Ohio. The question, though, is can I do that unilaterally without legislative authority and approval, without tying it up in litigation and creating more confusion? Now, imagine a scenario where the Secretary of State says you may install extra drop boxes, and some counties do and some counties don't, and then there's litigation that requires them to be unbolted from the ground and taken back out. So making changes like that 85 days before a presidential election is what my biggest concern is. I think that we should move forward with that. I'm going to be recommending that. I have recommended that to the General Assembly. I think the fact that we have drop boxes is good news, by the way. This is a new thing in Ohio. We didn't have those in every county until this April, and so we've got them now. I think that Ohioans need to recognize that the drop box is a great way to get your ballot back to the Board of Elections. The mail is also a great way to get your ballot back to the Board of Elections. By the way, in Ohio, you can track your ballot when you vote by mail. You can go to voteohio.gov/track, and you can find out when your ballot has been received by the Board of Elections so that you know that your voice is going to be heard. There are a lot of good choices for Ohioans. Drop boxes is just one of them, but it would be a nice convenience to add. I just don't want to subject our boards of elections to a bunch of litigation on this.
Andre, you want to pick up with where the best possible way to get this election done in the safest and easiest way possible?
Yes. To all of your listeners out there, the safest, secure place to vote is from your kitchen table. Request your absentee ballot. Like my sister Jen Miller said, it will reduce the lines and early voting in on election day. So that is the safest place to vote. And folks, I have some family members. I'm going to speak from experience. They get their absentee ballot. It's got to sit on the table 2 or 3 days before they open it. Then they got to open it up. Then they call Janie, Big Ma, and Sally and all them to talk to them about what's on it. And then they fill it out. And then it sits on that desk, just as you're leaving out the front door where the phone sits at, remember, it sits there for several days. No, folks, fill out your absentee ballot. Most of y'all know who y'all gonna vote for. Get it, fill it out, and send it in. And take it to your local Board of Elections if you're unsafe, and you drop it off at your local Board of Elections. And if you're like my grandmother who's not with us right now, but my grandmother, she believed the election was only on election day. It was the first Tuesday. You couldn't talk her out of it. She don't care nothing about early voting. Folks, if you got a grandmother like that out there, vote early or vote by absentee ballot so that my grandmother can be safe on that first Tuesday and it's not a long line for her. So that's my request. Vote by mail, vote early, and protect Big Ma and them on election day that believes election is only on Tuesday.
Jen?
So every voter needs an election plan. This is something we always talk about. I was just on a call with voters with developmental disabilities, but everybody needs an election plan. So first you need to decide whether you vote absentee early or on election day. We agree that we want as many as possible to vote absentee, which is by mail, or early for 28 days in person. Second, you need to figure out the logistics for each, because each works a little bit differently. What ID you need, what the time frame is, what the address is. So early voting is one location versus your polling location on election day. Then you need to make sure that you have your transportation. And let's remember, not all of us have cars. Not all of us have the easy way of getting to wherever we decide to vote, whether it's to drop it off at the Board of Elections or drive to the polling location. So we need to figure out those logistics. And then finally, you need to do your research, and vote411.org is actually the League of Women Voters nonpartisan voter guide, and I encourage you to check that out. You can compare candidates, you can see both sides of the issues. One thing that a lot of folks don't know is that we can't edit any responses whatsoever on vote411.org. So when the secretary was running for office, he had to answer his campaign had to answer the questions himself, right? We sent the login information, he answered them. If he didn't do it, but if he called me and said, Jen, there's a typo, I need you to fix that, I wouldn't be able to do that. He would have to log back in. Why? Because we just want to be the conduit between the voter and the candidate, the voter and the issue campaign. And so those are your four pieces. Decide how. We have 3 different ways. Get the logistics clear on each of those ways. Figure out your transportation. Make sure you have your ID. Do your research at vote411.org.
We're going to have questions from our audience in just a few minutes, but first, we want to hope that we have some live audience questions as well, and we will have some from our live stream audience as well as from them too. But, Mr. Secretary, I want to pick up with what we're talking about in terms of the best advice, given the situation that we're all in, unprecedented as it may be.
Yeah. I like Jen's strategy about having a voting plan. And again, it's important that people not procrastinate. The message that I have right now is get registered to vote. Sign up to be a poll worker is the other message, because we need 35,000 Ohioans to work the polls on Election Day. And I hope we get a chance to talk about that a little bit. Sign up to be a poll worker, but get registered to vote and be an evangelist for voting. If you yourself are registered already, then talk to a young person in your life who may have turned 18 this year, or somebody that may have moved, and help them get registered. I have a 21-year-old little brother, and at his 18th birthday, I stood there and made him fill out his voter registration form. And so now he could do it online, thankfully, because of the work that my colleagues up here did and that we did in the General Assembly. You can register to vote online, and so that's important. When you get your absentee ballot, you should send it in right away, as Jen said, and as Andre was saying, don't wait, especially as we are anticipating, and this is great news, that the boards of elections are going to see a higher volume of vote-by-mail ballots than they've ever seen in our state's history. And that's a good thing. Hopefully that forms a good new habit for people learning of this secure way to vote. But don't wait. We're talking about flatten the curve as it relates to the virus. We need to flatten the curve for our boards of elections as well. Imagine if everybody waits until October, late October, to request their absentee ballot. Imagine if everybody waits until the last week of October to send in their absentee ballot. The boards of elections are going to be absolutely swamped by that. And so we need to make sure that people are requesting their absentee ballots early and that they're mailing them in early. That's the best thing that you can do. And of course, early voting is another great option. If you want that in-person election day experience, you can get it for 4 weeks, including evening and weekend hours. We're one of only 5 states in the nation that has Sunday afternoon early voting. We're one of only 20 states that has Saturday afternoon, Saturday all-day early voting, evening hours. So there's a lot of good choices. And if you wait all the way until November 3rd, then we'll have that available for you too at a convenient neighborhood location, probably right along the bus route, probably pretty close to home. And so there's three good choices for Ohioans. Just pick which one works for you. They're all good, and make sure to carry that plan out.
You mentioned a higher volume of vote by mail than we've ever seen before.
Yeah.
Are you concerned with some of the rhetoric coming out of the White House as it relates to vote by mail and its integrity?
Yeah, absolutely, and I've spoken out about this. Thankfully, we in Ohio have a situation where the concerns that the president has raised and others have raised aren't valid here, and I've said that very clearly. In Ohio, both Republicans and Democrats trust voting by mail. It's been part of the way we vote in this state for close to 20 years. Our boards of elections are good at it. They know how to handle it. In some of our neighboring states, they're figuring out right now, how do we do no-fault absentee voting? They're figuring out how do they go from the 2 or 3%. I was just talking to my friend, the West Virginia Secretary of State. They historically only have 2 or 3% vote by mail because you have to have an excuse there to vote by mail. So there at the boards of elections, it's a manual process. Cut open the envelope. They handle it by hand because they only get a few dozen. Here at our county boards of elections, we're ready for that. We have the infrastructure in place. We've augmented that infrastructure. By the way, just a few years ago, the state of Ohio, 3 years ago precisely, the state of Ohio spent $115 million on all new state-of-the-art voting equipment for every county board of elections. And by the way, that put us way ahead of the rest of the country. Just over the last few months, as we've gotten millions of federal dollars in to help support voting, I have pushed 90%, over 90% of that out the door because I don't believe in hoarding resources here at the state capitol. We need to push it out to the county boards of elections. So the counties have been directed to use that money to invest not only in personal protective equipment, some of the stuff for election day voting, but in the things that they need to augment their election, their vote by mail process as well.
As prepared as you are,
Yeah.
we're now hearing that there are a number of changes that are occurring within the Postal Service that may or may not be getting orchestrated out of the White House. Does that threaten the infrastructure that you already have in place?
I tell you, as Jen was saying, the U.S. Postal Service is an important part of our government. It's an important part of our process. I think we need to emphasize the service part of U.S. Postal Service. We had a member of the U.S. Postal Service executive team on a call that we did. We do these weekly calls called the Ready for November Task Force, and they're streamed online if you're ever interested, with boards of elections and elections officials and advocates and experts. We brought this person in from the U.S. Postal Service and asked him those tough questions. The delays that we're seeing from the U.S. Postal Service are not acceptable. That is really the one thing that's outside of our control, is what the U.S. Postal Service does. We have requested that they, and by the way, also speaking as a National Association of Secretaries of State, we have requested that they make some important changes. I've told them very clearly that I don't think that cutting back overtime, for example, is a wise decision in the midst of the pandemic that we're facing. We've asked them to execute what they call an all-clear procedure, where they go through their sort facility and look for that elections-related mail. But there's also things that we're doing to be better postal customers. We've redesigned our absentee ballot envelope to make sure that it's optimized for moving as quickly as it can through that process. And again, voters should not wait to the last minute, and they should go online and track their ballot. And the other good thing that we have in Ohio is that as long as your ballot is postmarked by Monday, November 2nd, and as long as it's received within 10 days at the Board of Elections, it's going to count. In some states, it has to be received by Election Day. That's wild. I cannot believe that. But in Ohio, we allow for that time. Just don't try your luck. Don't wait till the very end to send in your ballot.
Andre, is the disruption in the Postal Service a form of voter suppression, in your opinion?
I'm just going to say absolutely, because if I say anything else, I may lose my religion today because I may not be kind. So yes, absolutely.
Jen?
I think we've covered that. I was hoping I could circle to poll workers for a second. Poll workers can make all the difference. If you're worried about election security, you're worried about a voter suppression or intimidation, poll workers are the backbone of our election system when you vote in person. They are the folks who are interacting directly with voters. And I can give you examples of where intimidation can happen. But also the flip of that is if you're the poll worker, then you can change how that goes. So an example is someone goes in with Down syndrome, and a poll worker might question whether their ability or right to vote, when actually it's the court that would decide that. Someone comes in with a language barrier, And a poll worker, and we hear these, not that I'm beating up on poll workers, because we love them and need them, but we hear of a poll worker question whether that individual is a citizen, even though they checked in and had the right documentation. And even my own staff person, the first time she's a naturalized citizen, the first time she went to vote, she unfortunately dropped her ID while she was getting on the bus, didn't realize it until she got off the bus at her polling location, and she was, and this was here in Columbus, was told, well, I don't know where you're from, but here we have to have an ID. Those are not the systematic issues. 99.9% of poll workers are absolutely incredible and wonderful and treat every voter with dignity. But one thing you can do is make sure that you're one of those poll workers, that you're making sure that everything is working as well as possible for every voter. And if you've thought about it in the past and never done it, we need you to this year, because 35,000 poll workers is what we need, and that's just on election day. We also need them for early voting, and so many of our poll workers are of older age. We estimate about 43% of our poll workers probably have some sort of concern about COVID-19. So please make sure you do that.
Mr. Secretary, yeah, go ahead.
That because thank you, Jen, for saying that. And you're right, 99% of our poll workers are very well trained and do the right thing, and there are outlier situations like the ones you mentioned that are certainly unacceptable. That's why poll worker training is so important as well, and we have standards for how the boards of elections do that, but it's done at the board level. Anybody that can hear me that's interested in being a poll worker, we need you. VoteOhio.gov/defenddemocracy is the place to sign up. We chose that URL very intentionally because when you join your fellow Ohioans as one of those 35,000, you'll be helping to defend democracy. VoteOhio.gov/defenddemocracy is the place to sign up. And by the way, 17-year-olds in Ohio can do it, and we're encouraging people of all kinds of, yes, Andre, sorry.
Yes, I want to just also talk about the importance of getting poll workers. Here in Franklin County and Delaware County, the A. Philip Randolph Institute, we're working with the clergy to get the word out that on Sunday morning on service, either virtually or online, asking for poll workers, especially the younger people. What we don't want to do is we don't want to have the Board of Elections, because they don't have enough poll workers, combine precincts and polling locations. Now, here we are, Miss Sally, who normally walks up the street to her polling location. Now, she got to walk or get on the bus and go clear across town. So we need poll workers. So we're going to expand this all over the state with, because in the African-American community, the church is the cornerstone of the community. So we're reaching out to our pastors, and we're asking them to announce this. So anybody out there, announce it at your church, to contact their local Board of Elections. We need poll workers. And I think I heard you say that this is the best way for somebody to see democracy right up front. I hope I'm saying it the way you said it, by being a poll worker. So thank you.
Mr. Secretary, we got a few seconds before we get to the audience here, but should Ohio be prepared to accept the fact that we may not know the winner on election night?
You know, we never know the winner on election night, right? I mean, we always have that unofficial canvass on election night, and then weeks later we have the certified result.
But
you're
longer
right
than usual.
I understand, and what I want Ohioans to know is that we know that there are going to be a lot of ballots that arrive on Wednesday and Thursday and Friday, and every one of those ballots matters. That's a manifestation of the commitment that we have that every vote needs to be counted. Now, we know that election day ends at 7:30 on election night, and we're going to start counting ballots. It'll go later in the night than it has traditionally. We know that, with a higher volume of vote by mail than we've ever seen. But here's where, again, we're in a position way ahead of some other states. In many states, just up the road in Michigan, they can't even start opening envelopes until election night. In Ohio, we can open those envelopes. We can check the identification information on there. We can start to actually scan the ballots. And so we will be able to report our results, I think, before a lot of other states. But again, that number will change 3 weeks later. That's not a sign that something nefarious is happening. That's the sign that democracy is working, and we're making sure that every vote counts. And so when the numbers change 3 weeks later, again, that's not a sign that something went wrong.
It is CMC's tradition to take audience questions. Jane Scott, CMC's president, is curating questions from the live stream audience. If you are here in our audience, please remember to keep your microphone timed to the question, and we thank you for avoiding editorial comments. Jane, what's our first question?
Well, we have a lot of questions, and I apologize. I knew we aren't going to get to all of them, but those people who ask questions ahead of time, you've covered much of it, so my apologies ahead. Kathy Fox had a question. New York Times reported today that the GOP is recruiting 50,000 poll monitors in 15 battleground states. How will Ohio make sure poll monitors don't discourage legal voting?
Yeah, I hadn't read that article yet. I know that really what they ought to be doing is recruiting poll workers, right? The best thing that you can do is sign up to be a poll worker. Being there as a monitor, I don't know what that really accomplishes. Really what we'd rather have is people signing up to be poll workers. But certainly anything that interferes with the rights of people to come in and cast their ballot and to do so in a free and unencumbered way is not something we're going to tolerate here in Ohio.
Jen?
So we promote both poll workers and election protection poll monitors. We both work with Election Protection League, NAACP, Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights. And let me just say this, there's two options. Being a poll worker is paid, it's all day long, you're inside working with voters. A poll monitor is someone who might be answering calls, could have a shorter shift, could be outside with apparel on that helps people understand that they are there to help them. In the past, those election protection poll monitors have been the data that have helped prove the need for things like election administration plans, post-election audits, early voting, actually. And so both matter. And if you're interested, please, you can contact the league or Andre for either of those options.
Andre, your thoughts on these monitors being there?
I didn't read that article either, but I'm just a little concerned, well, just curious as to why they need all those poll monitors. Like Jen said, we do poll monitors to make sure that people aren't disenfranchised, make sure that people are not discouraged, and that their rights aren't violated. So I'm just curious as to read that article and to see why do they need so many poll monitors when nonpartisan organizations like ours, we're already doing that work.
Our next question.
Hi, I'm Cheryl Roller, retired. I have a two-part question for Mr. LaRose, and this is a logistical question that I'd like to get on the record for people who like to help other people get the vote out. So the first part of the question is, if a group is registering other people to vote, I believe they are allowed to sell at cost stamps, single stamps, to the people that they're registering to vote?
So that's a legal question, but let me be very clear that what Ohio law doesn't permit is giving something of value for a vote. There has been a question in the past about whether a stamp constitutes something of value, and that's actually not a settled legal matter. But if you're selling somebody a stamp at cost, I can't see any problem with that.
Thank you. And then the other part is for people who are helping people. A neighbor, assuming a neighbor that you trust, could take multiple ballots to the drop-off box. Is that correct?
Not in Ohio. So in Ohio, the only person that can return your ballot to the Board of Elections or the drop-off box would be yourself or a family member. And a family member is defined pretty broadly. It includes, mom and dad and brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles. It's a pretty broadly defined definition. But it's you and your family member that can return your ballot to the Board of Elections for you. And by the way, this actual thing that you're talking about has led to problems in other states where people with bad intentions have gone around saying, hey, I'll deliver your ballot, and then they throw out the ones they don't want to take back. And so obviously that kind of thing is what we wouldn't ever want to see happen in Ohio.
Okay,
Yeah.
so a family member can take your ballot to the
Correct.
drop-off box?
Correct, yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Our next question, Jane?
Yes, this is from Janae Miller. What is being done about voter fraud, such as voters' names being erased from voter rolls of any reason? I think it's more of a general question about purging, which we really haven't talked about yet.
Jen, I'll talk about it, and then if you want to add something, does that work?
Yeah.
So in Ohio, we have a process that has been required for a long time. Both Republican and Democratic secretaries of state have carried it out. It's been upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court. It doesn't mean it's perfect by a long shot. I am duty-bound by my oath of office to carry out the law. And what that says is if you go 6 years without voting, if you don't have any activity with the Board of Elections, if you don't go into a BMV location, sign a petition, answer the multiple letters that we send, then the state law assumes that that person is deceased or moved out of state or whatever else, and they have to be removed from the voter rolls. That's been what's been required in Ohio for a long time. We found a creative way to do this better to make sure that we're not accidentally losing people off the rolls. We work really hard to get people registered to vote, so we want to keep them there. But at the same time, we don't want our rolls to be full of deceased voters or those that have moved out of state or duplicates or data entry errors that have been made by a board or whatever else. And so what we've done is started publishing that list ahead of time. See, in the old days, both Republicans and Democratic secretaries of state would just say to the boards of elections, on a certain date, hit delete, and delete all of those inactive voters from the rolls. We decided, hey, we can do this a little differently, and 4 months in advance, we can put that list together, we can publish it, we can share it with great community organizations like the League and the A. Philip Randolph Institute and many others, and we can find people. And by the way, we have, because of an agreement that Andre's organization and us were able to reach, we have what's called the A. Philip Randolph exception, where nobody who is removed from the rolls will be denied the ability to vote as a result of that. If they show up to vote and they had been removed from the rolls, they will still get the opportunity to vote. And so, we can modernize this. I'd like to see a more automated form of voter registration and keep more people on the rolls that way. But then again, that's something that we need to do through the state legislature.
Yeah, so let's be clear. So what we're saying is if someone doesn't vote for 6 years, we are assuming that they are dead or that they've moved out of state and removing them. Now, and yes, they get something in the mail, but they still have, it's several years before they would actually be removed from the voter rolls. And so one thing I'd like to commend the secretary on is multiple communications, which is not required by law. And I do think multiple communications is helpful. Those letters still don't make a lot of sense. So if, Cheryl, you haven't voted in 6 years, you didn't like the last presidential candidate, so you just sat it out, and you get a letter in the mail that says, hey, Cheryl, do you still live here? Let us know, or we're going to remove you. I think you think, yeah, I still live here. I'm reading this. So I don't think the process makes sense. We think there are far better ways to improve accuracy, like automatic voter registration or same-day registration. The other piece of transparency that we do appreciate is making these lists available in advance, because for the entire history of these purges, we have actually been saying we thought people were wrongfully being removed. And in this last September, when we got the list for the first time, because the secretary made it transparent and made it available, we found, in fact, that counties had made some massive mistakes and had put people into the list to be removed that statutorily should not have been there. They could have voted even just 3 months earlier. So I think we hope that the transparency will continue, but ultimately we hope that the purge process ends entirely and we go to better forms of list maintenance.
We have one more question from the audience.
Hi, I'm Dara Pizzuti. I'm with the Matriots. And you have all talked a little bit about getting people confident in the voting process and how important that is. And Curtis sort of stole my thunder a little bit, but I'm going to take it one step further. The seeds of doubt on the validity of this particular election being sown by the current administration, I have two questions. One is, does Ohio, or when you talk to your fellow secretaries of state, do they have a plan in mind for after the election if it is challenged? How they're going to handle that. And the other question I have is, I'm just curious, with the absentee ballots or the mail-in ballots, you said 20 to 25% in this last one. Do we have any data that tells us who prevails on those particular ballots? I mean, is it a certain portion of the community that tends to use that more than others? And what are we doing to, I guess, encourage more communities to take?
I'll start with the last question first. What we've seen is that general voter behavior tends to be mirrored in absentee voting behavior. And so in an area where there tend to be more Republicans or Democrats, it tends to follow that same pattern. I would say that, again, both Republicans and Democrats have trusted Ohio's vote-by-mail process for a long time. If there's a slight advantage, I would actually say we see more often, I think just by a fraction of a percent, that there are actually more Republicans that vote by mail than Democrats, and that tends to flip with early voting. But again, it's really negligible. As it relates to the question of the legitimacy of the election, my most sacred responsibility is making sure that Ohioans know they can trust their election. Somebody told me once, the reason we run elections is so the loser knows they lost. It sounds negative, but if you think about it, the ideal of American democracy, that peaceful transfer of power, is when the candidate who loses gets that call, or the candidate on election night calls their opponent and congratulates congratulates her on her victory and what have you. That's how it should work. Everything about democracy that I know is that the only power that elected officials have comes from the legitimacy that they get from the consent of the governed. And the consent of the governed is established through a free and fair election. That's why, for example, as the chief elections officer for the state of Ohio, even though I'm a member of the Republican Party, I've committed that I'm not endorsing any candidates. I'm not showing up at any rallies. I just don't believe that that kind of political engagement on my part is responsible. As it relates to what happens if people don't accept the outcome of the election, unfortunately, that turns to litigation. That's why it's so important that we be fully transparent. I always say there's nothing to hide at the Board of Elections. Everything we do is an open book for everyone to see, and that's important that we keep it that way so that people know that they can trust elections. And Curtis, let me just end with this. We, as centers of influence, the fact that you're engaged in this conversation, watching this on television, you're somebody that others turn to for information because you're an informed voter. We need to stop telling people elections are all messed up because they're going to believe us, right? Elections are pretty good. We've come a long way. And in the state of Ohio and around the country, elections do have consequences and they are run fairly and people should participate. Where there are problems, we need to fix them, but let's stop telling people that our elections are a mess because they're not. They're actually well run, better than anywhere else on the earth as far as I'm concerned. So.
Jay?
Ron Geisinger asks the question, what will be done to protect poll workers from COVID? If prospective poll workers feel safe, they are more likely to sign up.
I just put out a 48-point secure health guidance for the boards of elections. It includes requirements like all the poll workers are going to be wearing masks. It includes requirements for social distancing, sanitizing of the voting machines. That extends, by the way, to the early voting locations. It's very clear, concise guidance for the boards of elections that was done in coordination with the Centers for Disease Control and the Ohio Department of Health, as well as the Association of Elections Officials. You can view that on our website, voteohio.gov. But what it lays out is a very clear set of standards for how we're going to run our polling locations. And by the way, it takes a cue from what we've seen, the creativity from Ohio's private sector businesses, like here at the Boathouse. Look at all the things that they did to make it a safe experience for us today. And that's the kind of thing that we're going to be following at the polling locations as well.
Jen?
Just going to say, some people might be asking why we still have COVID in Ohio. Why would we close the polls in the primary and have them open in the fall? And the bottom line is, let's keep in mind the timeline. We had a week before Election Day when we knew that our first confirmed case of COVID was here. At that time, there was a run on supplies. All of these processes would need to change. Poll workers would need to be retrained. There wasn't enough supplies to do this safely. And the league, while we did not like all the confusion, and we certainly regretted the short time frame voters had to, and boards of elections for that matter, to vote by mail, that 4 weeks just wasn't enough. We agreed with that decision. But we also firmly agree with keeping the polls open in the fall, and we think with more time it can be safe. But if you are really interested in protecting poll workers or folks like Andre's sweet grandmother, who I love hearing stories about, then vote early or vote absentee.
We got a few seconds, Andre. We'll give you the last one.
I just want to tell everyone that I was with the Secretary of State several weeks ago when he did a press conference in Cuyahoga County Board of Elections, and I drove up there just so that I can see for myself how secure voting will be and how safe it will be, not just for the people coming in to vote, but for our poll workers. And I'm telling you now, voting in person is going to be safe and secure for workers and for the people that come in to vote. I saw it with my eyes. I had to see it before I promoted poll workers, and I saw it, and I'm comfortable. And I'm trying to push as many people as I can to be poll workers.
Thank you to our panelists. Let's turn things back over to Steve.
I hope you enjoyed today's forum. Found it very entertaining and enlightening. It's great to see people who are standing up for our right to vote, trying to make sure that we have access to the ballot box, because it is probably what separates us from most civilized countries in this world. So remember, if you like CMC, you can join right now at columbusmetroclub.org and receive 2 months bonus membership. And be sure to check out and register for Conversation 2020, presented by CMC and Cardinal Health, Black History 101 Mobile Museum on August 26th and 27th. We hope you'll tune in next Wednesday at noon online or in person here at the Boathouse as we continue the series Racism, Where Do We Go From Here, as we explore the history of police in Columbus. Don't miss this conversation. Thanks to our live stream partners, WOSU Public Media, PNC, the Columbus Dispatch, and WBNS. To our online virtual seat patrons, thank you. And a special thanks to our speakers, the Honorable Frank LaRose, Jen Miller, Andre Washington, and Curtis Jackson. We hope to see you again soon, but until then, be well and stay safe.